Okay, we're back and we're ready, and I believe our sound system should be fixed. So let's cross our fingers and keep going.
Dr. Sperry, we were talking earlier about impetigo.
Yes.
And I'm going to show you what has been marked as State's Exhibit 408 and ask you this way and see if this helps you in any way. What does that look like to you?
Well, this is the top of the left ear, the pinna, and you can see these lesions. But the hair, of course, has been shaved, and this hair has been cleaned. It's washed, and the crusts on the surface have been washed off. Oddly, I mean, it could be a burn. I mean, that's what it looks like after it's been altered and changed like this. It's very unusual because, like I said, it's been cleaned, and you can see some little edges of skin along the edge, and there's a certain amount of drying as well. This reddish yellow appearance is drying. So, without seeing what it looked like from the emergency room and the hair crusted to it, this could be certainly mistaken for something else.
Okay. And when you say the crusting was washed off, can you explain to us what you're talking about?
Well, sure. Here you can see the hair on the child. This is from the emergency room. The hair is kind of stuck to these little areas, and there's some yellow crustiness that's just fluid. The inflamed area just leaks out. But this is very typical of impetigo, these reddened areas with crusts on the surface, because it's a bacterial infection of the skin that's easily treated with antibiotics, but it very typically will appear up in the ears, on the face. Sometimes it can be across the face on a young child, but the crusts just come from the tissue fluid that is leaking out of the lesions themselves, and then everything like here where there's hair, it just gets stuck to it.
I want to show you what I have marked as Defendant's Exhibit 152 and 153. Can you tell us what these marks are right here?
Well, in the location here, just below the buttock, they look like finger grabs, finger marks to me, where the hand has been placed and perhaps shifted a little bit, but where the ends of the fingers have been, there and caused these superficial injuries.
And with regard to that white band that we saw earlier, that we talked about earlier,
Yes.
when you say it's a pressure point, from what exactly would it be a pressure point from?
Oh, well, it could be from a variety of things. And I was just looking, actually, Dr. Darasad described it as a broad hypopigmented, which means pale, a hypopigmented mark, which it doesn't describe it as a scar or really much of anything else. It's it's a pale area for some reason, but it's, as I said earlier, it doesn't have features of a scar, and she didn't describe it as a scar. Now, what this then could mean is at some point the child's abdomen was, against the edge of something, or there was a strap, perhaps, in an ambulance, say, transporting the body that was across the front of the body. It could be from a variety of different possibilities, but the whole point really being that it's not a scar and it's not an acute or a fresh injury that would be caused by something else.
Could it be caused by the diaper having been up higher than it is on the picture.
Well, it could, yes. With the elastic edge of a diaper, pulled up to this area, yes, I could do that.
We saw earlier a bruise on the head of Layla. Let me ask you, could that bruise have been caused, I'm sorry, let me show you what I've marked as 170 and see if you can identify that.
Yes, I think this is like a bed area. It looks like, yeah, I think those are, the perspective is kind of odd, but it's like, yeah, there it is. It's a bed and a headboard, kind of inside of a bunk cubby hole sort of thing.
Do you recognize that as being in the house that Jennifer and Joseph occupied?
Yes, I remember seeing that photograph as part of the interior photos of the house.
Your Honor, I would tender the defendant's 170 into the record and ask to publish.
Any objection? Submitted, 170. You may publish.
If a child is jumping up and down and hitting her head against the top of the upper bunk, would you expect to see bruising on that child's head if it was done repeatedly?
Sure. Yes, that's why you're not supposed to jump on beds, much less bunk beds.
Let's talk about the internal injuries on Layla. Starting with her arm, can you tell us what about the right ulna? Explain to us what is significant about the right ulna and the break of the right ulna.
I think you mean the left ulna?
The left
Yes.
ulna, I'm sorry.
Yes. There was, after the child passed away, x-rays were done of the body, which is typical. And this is, certainly recommended. And it was found that there was a fracture, a break in the left ulna bone, which is the bone that connects your elbow to your wrist on the side of your little finger. And there were, from the x-ray alone, there was evidence that there had been some type of healing, overgrowth of bone, making a lump, we call it callus. But on the x-ray, the fracture line, or the line between the ends of the fractured bone, could still be seen, on the x-ray alone. So then when at the autopsy, this bone was removed, and again, it's very easy to see that there is the space in between the fractured ends still remains. So all that can really be told from the x-ray itself is that there is a fracture, there is some evidence of some degree of healing. I mean, it's not something that happened just within a few days, even a couple of weeks, because the changes would be difficult. But that the fracture line, that is that space between the ends of the bone, could still be seen on the x-ray. And that's about the limits of what you can see on the x-ray itself.
And what is that called?
Well, it's a fracture. There's evidence of healing, but more specifically, portions of this fracture were processed and little glass slides made as part of all of the different tissue slides that were examined. And microscopically, that is, looking at these slides under the microscope, the changes that are going on in this fracture are very different from what would be expected and anticipated normally in a healing fracture. There is evidence that this fracture has not healed. It's been there for a very long period of time, and possibly months perhaps. There's no way really to know. It's not 3 or 4 weeks old. it's much older than this, and it's just not healed. The healing process has not progressed. In fact, it sort of had halted, and the ends of the fractured bone, different cells, cartilage cells, things are growing that are evidence that this fracture is just not healing the way that it's supposed to heal. And as a consequence, there's different terms that can be used. Non-union, meaning a fracture that does not heal over a long period of time, usually months, or just simply poor healing, improper healing. And that's usually, although it's rare in children, but still, if a fracture happens, especially in a long bone, and the bone is not put in a cast to immobilize the fractured ends, then they continue to move just a little bit, but enough such that the normal healing process can't progress and form all of the structures that need to be formed to finally put the pieces of bone back together. And that's what is actually present in the microscopic sections of this ulnar fracture, that this fracture is not healing properly and has been there for a long time.
And can you put a date on how long a time? Are we talking about 2-3 weeks, or are we talking about 2-3 months?
Well, it's definitely older. I should say at about 3 to 4 weeks or so, the ends of the fractured bone should be pretty well stuck together, and the line, that is the line that shows the break, it should be gone. And it's replaced by new bone that is growing across the fracture to attach the ends of it. But here, the fracture, the ends are wide open, and again, as I said a couple of times, the normal healing process is not progressed the way it's supposed to heal. And so this is, and also the last thing is that by about, somewhere around 3 to 4 weeks approximately, any dead bone that is in this fractured region really should be cleaned out. The body's systems that heal everything will clean out the dead bone. And there's a lot of fragments of dead bone that are still within the inside of the ulnar fracture on Layla's arm. So how old this could be? This could definitely be months, many months old. Once the healing process gets disrupted and continues to get disrupted, it just doesn't get better, and it will keep the same appearance. The dead bone is not cleared out like it's supposed to be. The cartilage is overgrown. It's, again, the body trying to heal the fracture, but it's just the normal healing process is messed up, and this could go on, as I said, for many months.
Showing you what's been marked as 467, States Exhibit 467, does that assist you in your description of the ulna?
Yes, this is the forearm bones that were removed at the autopsy, and this bone here is the radius. It's the bone that connects your elbow to your wrist on the thumb side, and this right here in the middle is the ulna fracture, and you can see the space that's still in between it. In fact, it looks like maybe the bone is being twisted just a little bit to enhance or to show how large this space is. And on the inside, there's lumpiness, which is just the tissues that are trying to heal this fracture. But and the last thing is on the outside, there is overgrowth of bone on the outside of this fracture, but it's not extending onto the inside. So the surface of the bone is reacting, but the inside of the bone is just not healing properly. And this is the appearance to the naked eye, at least, of what this fracture looked like. But without looking at it under the microscope, you really can't tell give any more definite information about what's going on, whether it's healing properly or not, and then how old, if even that can be done.
You looked at it under the microscope, did
Yes.
you not? And what did you find when you looked at it under the microscope?
Well, I found that there was, as I mentioned several times, overgrowth of big islands of cartilage, which should not be growing in this way. It's a marker of poor healing. The bone is trying to heal itself, but it's just not working correctly because the ends of the fracture are not really being held immobile as they should. And there was, and then, as I said, the fracture line was still wide open with no bridging, nothing connecting the two ends of the bone. And those are all features of abnormal and significantly delayed healing.
And do you call this a non-union injury?
Well, a non-union really means that the bone is not uniting in the way it's supposed to, and so the fracture itself is never uniting. It's never healing properly. I mean, a different way to look at it or call it is just evidence of inadequate or poor healing that is delaying the healing process. And once this kicks in, once there is a delay because the bone is not healing properly, again, this appearance can persist for many months, sometimes even longer than that. And sometimes it's necessary, if it's detected somewhere along the line, then surgery may have to be done to actually put a plate in and immobilize everything, and even clean out and remove the the abnormal, improper healing tissues, just to allow the whole process to start and go the way it should.
Would you expect that a layperson should be able to know whether or not the arm was fractured by sight alone?
Oh, by sight alone? No. I mean, initially, in the first few days, the arm, it would be swollen and tender, and the child would not want to use her arm, and it'd be sore to touch. But over the course of a few days, that feeling, that generally goes away. And if the bone is not healing properly, as this bone was not healing properly, pretty much they don't cause any problems. The only problems that occur is like in long bones in the leg where a child is weight bearing, walking, running, things like that. But otherwise, you can't see anything from the outside, and I wouldn't expect the child really to complain of much because the initial painful phase is well over.
Would you be surprised if an orthopedist were palpating and did not find the breach before the death?
No, that wouldn't surprise me a bit, given the nature of what this is. This is an old fracture that's not healing properly, and it would be difficult to feel with any reliability if someone were palpating or feeling the bone like this. I think it'd be rather challenging, frankly.
Doctor, moving on to the 8th rib of Layla.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that 8th rib and how significant it is to you?
Well, the right 8th rib was found, again, during the course of the autopsy. It was never suspected before this, but the right 8th rib in the back was found to have a healing fracture. And now that particular fracture under the microscope appeared to be healing properly, and the normal phases of healing were present, and there wasn't anything abnormal such as in the ulna. I would estimate that this fracture was probably somewhere about maybe 3 to 4 weeks old. Most of the fracture line was gone, and there was just the new bone replacement was appropriately taking place. Now, what that means, well, first of all, 3 to 4 weeks is the best approximation that I think I could give, and probably anyone else could give. It's not possible to look at a healing fracture either with the naked eye or under the microscope and say this is exactly 21 days old or 18 days old. That's impossible to do because, again, everyone is different, and the healing phases, things are so gradual that the difference between one day and the next can be very, very subtle. Eventually, the fracture heals, but before that time, all you can do is give broad estimates. Now, the location of the fracture that is in the back, the right 8th rib on the posterior or the back of the chest, I mean, for me as a forensic pathologist, it's concerning in a 2-year-old child just because the fractures of this at this location in a young child are suspicious for inflicted injury, that someone else, hurt the child in some way to cause this fracture, because it's a very unusual location for an accidental rib fracture, and is also much more commonly seen in when inflicted injury has occurred. But the limitation is obviously one of not being able to tell exactly how old it is, and only giving a time frame, giving a time range, and that's about it. And without information, if it even exists, that says when a child, say, was under the specific custody of one person versus another, it's essentially impossible to narrow it down to say one person or perhaps even several persons. You just don't know. And again, the uncertainty of saying it's 3 to 4 weeks old. Well, does that mean it's 21 days or 28 or 26? You see, that just makes it very, very difficult. Is it concerning to me as a pathologist, as a forensic pathologist? Yes, but those are the limits that I would have.
Doctor, I want to talk about some of the testing that was done in this case. You said you reviewed crime lab reports.
Yes.
Do you recall reviewing a report about amylase testing?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury what that is?
Sure. Amylase is a digestive enzyme that there's different kinds that are found in the body. The most common locations are from saliva, but amylase helps break down carbohydrates like potatoes, for instance. And it's the saliva has one type, and also the pancreas secretes another type to help with the digestive process after food has gone through the stomach and into the intestine. So it's basically a digestive enzyme.
That digestive enzyme was tested for on the floor of the kitchen, is that correct?
Excuse me, yes.
And what was the result?
Well, the result was that it was positive, it was negative. In fact, I just had that, negative for amylase from swabs taken from a couple of odd, slimy-looking areas that were apparently on the kitchen floor.
And why is that significant or not significant to you, that there was no amylase?
Well, it's an unusual thing to do on, spots on a kitchen floor, particularly. I mean, the idea is that perhaps we're trying to look for evidence of saliva, of spit, because that's the glands in your mouth secrete amylase, and potentially finding that could indicate that this was of oral origin, but or came from the mouth. But without further information, it becomes very difficult to put much credence onto whether something is positive or negative. For instance, if it's vomit, if it's stomach juices that have come up from the stomach, I would expect those not to have amylase in them. If it's something that originated in the stomach and was retched or represented vomit, and the fact that there's not amylase doesn't eliminate, it doesn't tell you where it's from, really, particularly. And without more definitive information, say this is definitely saliva, if someone knew that, well, then one could possibly test it for amylase or not. Brian, it's a very strange way to do forensic testing. And the other problem is I'm not aware of forensic standards that exist for just testing slimy stuff on a kitchen floor, and how reliable that testing is, whether to determine whether it's positive or negative, and then trying to make some sense from it after that. I've frankly never encountered it in my entire career in this particular context.
Could they have tested for gastric juices?
Well, sure.
And what would that have told you if it came back positive for gastric juices?
Well, it would tell you it's from the stomach. Stomach juices are very, very, very acid. There's a lot of hydrochloric acid, excuse me, that is made within our stomachs. And if someone vomits some stomach juices, the simple way to test for this is to use a pH strip. Like maybe some of you who may have been in high school chemistry remember the little strips that turn different colors depending on whether something is acid or alkali, that sort of thing. And then you can tell how strong the acid is or how strong the alkali is. And that's an extremely simple way to test for stomach juices, because stomach juices are very acid, and pH strips would turn acid. They would show there's a very large component of acid making up this stuff. So that would be extremely easy to do.
Was that testing done?
No, not that I know of.
Doctor, I want to talk to you about patterned injuries. What are patterned injuries?
Well, patterned injuries are injuries that are typically we see on the skin that have a structure to them that reflects the structure or the makeup of what maybe had struck the skin. So there can be like a rope with a weave pattern that if the rope strikes the skin, then there is an impression, a weave pattern that's impressed on the skin and gives a particular contour and shape to the bruises or the scrapes that are left behind. So that's basically what pattern injuries. Pattern injuries are caused by something that has an identifiable structure that when it strikes the skin leaves an impression that you can then identify where it came from. Sometimes they're incredibly specific.
Did you see any patterned injuries on Layla's body?
Well, I didn't. I did not see anything that I would myself characterize as being, clearly a pattern type of injury.
Did Dr. Darasoff see any patterned injuries in her autopsy?
No, I don't recall that she did either.
Did you see any marks that looked like belt marks to you?
No, I did not to such an extent that I could look at them and reliably conclude that they were marks caused by a belt.
Now, talking about the internal injuries, the transection of the pancreas and the splitting of the liver, can you tell us what, to reasonable medical certainty, you believe caused that?
Sure. Well, the liver, I'm watching myself here, is located mostly to the right, on the right side of your body, just underneath the rib cage, but it extends a little bit to the left as well. So there's part of the liver that's right in the middle, just below your breastbone. And behind that, anatomically, the pancreas is located, excuse me, also as well. Pardon me. And both of these, in their location, sit just in front of the spine. So the vertebra, the spine, goes straight up, and then the liver and the pancreas really sit right on top and in front. So if there is some type of pressure that is pushed very hard on the upper front of the abdomen, say right just below the breastbone, this will push the liver and the pancreas against the spine, and if there's a great deal of force, it can cause injury, a tear to the liver, as was found here, and even a large tear to the pancreas. Now, this is again, this tells you where the force was located and how it was exerted, but if this was, the location is something, it was a place where, say, for instance, the Heimlich maneuver potentially could do this, or very aggressive CPR, pushing on the child's chest and upper abdomen in a very frenzied, panicked sort of way, trying to resuscitate the child, trying to get the blockage out of the airway, doing whatever is necessary to try to save the child's life, and in untrained hands especially, with this just an incredible, well, again, frenzy is about the best way I can look at it. Just, fear and emotional panic going on. A lot of force could be used that is more than what's necessary, but then again, there's no way, again, for an untrained person to know how much is needed, and the child is dying.
Doctor, with regards to the chicken that was found in the sink, what could have been done with regards to preserving that for testing?
Oh, well, that could have been collected easily and frozen to be analyzed later. Chicken has specific DNA, so that would be very easy to do. Also, taking little pieces and looking at them under the microscope, you can tell what chicken looks like, or that is, pathologists can tell what chicken looks like, looking at it under the microscope, looking at little slices. So it could have been tested and analyzed very readily to identify it as being chicken. This wouldn't be very difficult to do. It'd be very simple. It's really a matter of collecting it and saving it, and then the testing and analysis could be done, at leisure, really.
The injuries that you saw in this case would it surprise you if other medical trained people said they'd never seen such injuries before for CPR or Heimlich maneuver?
It wouldn't surprise me in the sense that this is everything that we see in Layla, virtually everything, with a couple of exceptions of little bruises, everything is recent. I mean, it happened very, very quickly. And the injuries are located in different places on the outside of her body, and also specifically really on the inside of her body in very, very specific places. But in the context of sort of, I don't know, how would you say, a routine CPR or resuscitative maneuvers carried out by trained people, then injuries can occur, but they're not common, not usual, but they still can occur even in the best of hands. But when one is looking at it from the perspective of an untrained person who is watching, who really does not know what to do or has the barest sense of what should be done, and is watching a child choke and realizing that whatever, that this is not getting better, then this escalates very dramatically. And so, yes, this amount of injury and the extent of the injury is very pronounced, but again, you have to look at the circumstances. One has to look, we as pathologists have to look at everything that's involved as well as just the injuries themselves. And when you approach it from that context, it's not surprising to me that the injuries are so excessive appearing, because it was a life or death situation.
Doctor, we talked about Layla. Let's talk a little bit about Millie and her injuries. If you would look at this and tell me if you see any belt marks or buckle marks or strap marks on this photo.
I don't see anything like that. Not that I can identify. I've looked at this photo, I can't tell you how many times, and turned it, and twisted it, and looked at it. And I cannot discern, I cannot make out a pattern from this that it reflects, a belt or something with such a specific structure that it leaves or would have left a distinct pattern behind. I just can't see it.
With regards to this injury, could this injury have occurred as a result of sliding down and hitting rungs on a ladder?
Yes, yes, it can. There's not a way, again, to know exactly how old it is. That's impossible. But it's, that's what alternative sorts of, explanations of different sorts have to be looked at. And I think that's reasonable. I don't see have a problem with that, really.
Why is it impossible to do any testing of dates on these bruises?
Well, obviously, Millie is alive. So, as I told you earlier, looking at injuries like this, it is not possible to look at these injuries and tell how old they are, whether it's minutes, hours, even a few days, because we can't do biopsies, we can't look at pieces under the microscope because this is from a living child. So there's a very dramatic limitation to this, and it's also assuming even that all these happen at the same time too, where there's no way to know that. That's the fundamental problem. I mean, scientifically, you cannot look, there's no professional who can look at an injury and tell you how old it is. They can guess or whatever, but it's the difference between scientifically and reliably being able to make a statement and, giving an opinion that may or may not be accurate. And that's the limitation. There is no medical literature that exists that I'm aware of that tells a physician or a nurse that, by using whatever criteria that exist, you could look at a bruise, look at an injury, and tell how old it is. There is nothing that tells us that. Everything that exists in writing tells us just the opposite. We can't because of those limitations. And that's reality.
Doctor, didn't show you what the marker states Exhibit 79. Do you see anything on the back of this child that gives you any concern for inflicted injury?
No.
I want to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 78. Would you categorically state to a reasonable degree of medical certainty that this is inflicted injury, no doubt, regardless of the context?
No. I mean, it's on the inside surface of the arm, but that in and of itself does not, especially in an active child, that does not immediately mean that this is inflicted, and that's the only way that it occurred was it being inflicted by someone else. You just can't do that. The context, again, the story of this child is old enough to have given a story, to explanation, but just looking at that one alone and unequivocally saying this is inflicted injury is just not possible to do.
Doctor, if the child made a statement that she obtained these injuries during gymnastics when her knee hit her elbow as she came off a bar, would you have any problem with that explanation?
Well, no, that's a fairly clear explanation from her as far as how this occurred. I don't have a problem with it.
Doctor, I just want to talk a little bit about why is this a GBI case? Why is it not a Henry County case?
Oh, sure. Well, I can tell you, up until about 2008, all of the autopsy examinations that were done upon deaths that occurred here in Henry County were done through the DeKalb Medical Examiner's Office with a contract that...
Do you have to object to the relevance of this? What is the relevance?
The relevance of it is, I approach rather than talking.
Well,
Dr. Dowd, let's move on.
Dr. Who?
I'm sorry, Dr. Sperry, let's move on. Why did you go to the house? Did you go to 1521 Lincoln Terrace?
Well, I went to the house because this is a very unusual case for me as a pathologist over my career. It's unusual and certainly is concerning because of the extensive nature of the injuries and the types of injuries that are there. And the more I looked, and also, I had seen the interview with Ms. Rosenbaum, and I was really myself curious to see, I wanted to see the house, the inside of the house myself, and the relationship between the kitchen and the sink and the dining table and the living room area. And I also wanted her to explain to me, if she would, what happened. And that was really what I asked her to do. Show me what happened, tell me what happened. And I gave her no direction in anything. And she didn't even know that I had read or looked at anything. I didn't tell her anything about all that. But she and her husband knew I was coming. But I wanted her to show me what happened as best as she could in the sequence of events. And at that time, I had already seen the photos and I had read through the report, so I had a good understanding of what was there on Layla's body. And I wanted to correlate, if I could, what Ms. Rosenbaum showed me, what was happening and what she did with what I could see on Layla's body. And that was the reason. It's not something that is usual. I've gone to some scenes, a few scenes in my career, but usually it's those where there are some significant questions that I want resolved in my mind, if at all possible. Whether, it doesn't matter whether what I see concurs or not. I want to know as best as possible what is it that happened, so that I can, if it can be done, explain or put everything in a relationship. Sometimes things don't match up at all, and that's just the way it is. I've had plenty of circumstances like that, and usually it doesn't ever get to a point like this. But that was the reason why, just so I could see myself and listen to her show me and tell me what happened, and understand it as best as possible.
Was her lawyer there present?
No.
Was it, who was present?
Mr. Rosenbaum, just she and her husband were there, and that's it.
Why is the sink relevant?
Well, the sink is relevant, first of all, because this is part of what Ms. Rosenbaum describes as the totality of everything that happened. That there was a point where she had Layla up against the sink and was pushing her. Excuse me.
I would object to anything that was, I would object as hearsay as anything that occurred at this meeting at the house. Just say the objection.
I just limit to what you've heard
Okay.
in the report that Ms. Rosenbaum gave to the police.
Oh, all right. Well, she had the child at the sink, and ultimately there was what appeared to be a piece of chicken that was coughed out into the sink, and from the scene photographs that were taken, as I understand, once everything transpired, the scene was preserved, so nothing was changed or altered. There's a hunk of what looks like to me chicken that's there in the sink, and again, that was never collected or analyzed or tested or anything else, but it was there in the sink, which again, in the totality of everything altogether, was a puzzle piece that fit in.
When you looked at the totality of the circumstances within a reasonable degree of medical certainty, what do you believe caused the injuries in this case?
In my opinion, the injuries to Layla were caused by inadvertent injuries resulting from panicked and chaotic attempts to save her life when she was choking on a piece of chicken. That escalated, and everything got worse in a short period of time because the chicken was still stuck in her throat and she was in the process of suffocating.
Is there any evidence that you have seen that you can definitively say that this child had, in fact, a seizure following a traumatic incident? Is there any evidence to support that contention?
No, there's nothing at all that I saw. And seizures are, most of the time for us as pathologists, a diagnosis of exclusion. In other words, we exclude other things and maybe end up with a seizure. It's pretty much restricted to individuals who have a history of a seizure disorder of some sort. So we know there's a problem already. But otherwise, there's really no marker. There's nothing pathologically that we can find in an autopsy that allows us to say, aha, there was a seizure.
Thank you, Dr. Sperry. That's all I have right now. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Ross?
Yes, Judge.
Would you like the lights on or off?
For now, we can put them on. I'm sure we'll have them on soon.
Let on or off? He's asking us to turn them on.
Good afternoon, Dr. Sperry.
Good afternoon.
All right, so let's start off by finding some things that we can agree on. How about that?
We can try.
All right. Would you agree with me that people who are dead do not bruise?
People who are dead do not bruise?
Correct.
Generally, I mean, no, just for the most part, a beating heart and a blood pressure is required at least for bruises to form. You know, it's not universal, but in general, that's how we look at it.
In general, that's how you look at it. So all of the bruising that occurred to Layla happened while she still had a heartbeat?
I would say yes, that there was blood was being pushed through, you know, her system, whether it was from her own heart or CPR, but yes, there was, you know, some blood pressure, you know, a pressure wave, yes.
So you think that the amount of bruising that we've seen today on, say, the back could have come from CPR if she was dead?
Well, if she was, you know, completely dead and her heart had stopped, if indeed at that point, you know, CPR was being done, I would expect some slight hemorrhage, but probably not, at least, the extent of what we see here.
All right, so you wouldn't expect to see the extent of what we see here if she was already deceased, correct?
Correct, not the extent. There could be some, I've seen varieties of it, but this is, to me, everything that I've seen pretty much tells me that, I mean, her heart was beating to some degree.
Okay. And so you say that her heart was beating to some degree when the bruising occurred?
Yes. So
now, are you aware that when the EMTs arrived, that they said that she had no pulse?
Correct.
Okay. So would you agree that at that point she was dead?
I think for all intents and purposes, yes. Excuse me, no pulse was ever regained, so, you know, I would say technically, you know, she was dead at that point.
Okay. So would you agree with me then that none of the bruising would have been caused by any of the resuscitative methods that the EMTs undertook?
I think that's fair. There's a few small things that, like under the chin, there was a scrape, which I think Dr. Darasaw took a piece of and found nothing. Certain things that could well have come from the resuscitation, but really didn't show anything microscopically, other than a few things scattered here and there, mostly around the face and the head. Most everything else, I would say, occurred prior to the time the EMTs were there.
Would you also agree with me that as the heart slows, the blood pressure drops?
Yes.
And if the blood pressure drops, the extent of bruising also drops with that, correct?
That should be what happens. I mean, I'm not sure that's completely predictable all in that way, but, you know, as a general concept, that makes sense.
So you agree with me then?
Well, as a general concept, yeah. It's again, everyone is different, and there's exceptions to everything. But you know, as the blood pressure drops, again, the amount of blood being pushed through the blood vessels diminishes. Now, how that really affects the extent of bruising itself, that's, you know, much harder to say. Unfortunately, you know what, we can't ever conduct experiments to try this out.
Well, I agree, because we can't kill people purposely, correct?
Yeah, no, it's considered, you know, that's well, we don't do that in this society.
Correct. We don't. That's against the law, right?
Yes.
Now, would you agree with me that kids can heal at different rates or different speeds than adults?
Oh, I mean,
as a general matter.
In general?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, everyone is different, and children, especially because they're growing, their metabolic rate is a little bit higher, and so certain aspects of healing, potentially can be faster than adults. Certainly faster than significantly older people like me, as long as I don't fall off the thing anymore.
Mm-hmm. So kids, was that a yes? Kids, there are certain things that kids heal faster, correct?
Again, as a general concept, basically yes.
Okay. Bones being one of them.
Bones, again, generally yes.
Now, can we also, are you familiar with the term a protected area of the body?
Yes.
And would the neck be considered a protected area of the body?
Potentially, especially the back of the neck or the upper high sides, places that on the neck that would not, say, be inadvertently injured from a fall or through plague, things like that.
How about this right here?
This right there?
Yeah.
I've never thought about the side of the neck as being a protected area. I guess it depends on how, what it is that we're speaking about. I've just never, no one's ever asked me that before.
Okay. Well, are you familiar with the research that shows that less than 0.2% of injuries to the neck are accidental?
I think that's reasonable. That's probably fair.
Okay. So then can we agree it's probably a pretty protected area if it's not getting routinely accidentally injured?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that.
How about the ears? Are the ears a protected area?
Generally, unless, again, a child falls and strikes strikes the side of their head on something and the ear happens to be in between. But ear injuries alone are fairly unusual.
They are fairly unusual, aren't they?
Yeah.
And in fact, there are certain telltale signs of things like pulling on an ear or slapping an ear, correct?
Yes, there are sometimes injuries that can be seen that are fairly specific for those types of actions.
And called petechiae?
Well, petechiae are little pinpoint hemorrhages. Mm-hmm. They can come from impact injuries. Superficial little bruises or asphyxia. They're not specific as far as what can cause them.
They're not specific. I'm sorry, you got off there.
No, as far as for what can cause them. You can see petechiae in fairly minor bruises sometimes.
I'm showing you State's Exhibit 320. It's behind you.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
And I'm just going to point. I have a laser pointer, so I can point behind you. Don't worry, I won't do it in your eye. How about right here? Do you see those areas right there?
You're talking these here? I see those
Yes.
little discolorations, yes.
Okay, would you consider those to be petechiae?
No,
No, you wouldn't? Okay.
no, they're a little larger. Petechiae literally means pinpoint.
How about this one right here? It's kind of the same picture, or same area, but different view.
Again, it looks like, I can see these here and here. I would not call them petechiae just because they're a little larger.
But it's a bruise?
It may be, it possibly could be.
Okay. And to get a bruise right there, that would be consistent with, say, a slapping or a pulling of the ear or some kind of trauma to the earlobe, correct?
It could be, yes.
Generally, you don't fall and hurt just your tiny little earlobe and not any other part of your face, correct?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay, so that's probably what so that would be consistent with the little bruises right here could be consistent with a pinching or a pulling or a slapping.
Yeah, and your phraseology is right. It could be consistent with it. I don't have a problem with that.
How about I'm showing you State's 323, the back of her ear right here.
Oh, this right here?
Yeah.
Yes, it looks to be a small bruise. Again, I wouldn't call it, it's too large for a petechiae.
Okay, and yeah,
But it looks to be a small bruise.
Small bruise. Now, would you expect someone to say, I don't know, fall and hit the back of their ear just right there?
No, that would be unusual in and of itself without some, potentially some other, injury on the outer part of the ear as well.
So that could be consistent with, say, a slapping or a yanking of the ear.
Possibly, I don't know about the yanking particularly, but it could be, well, again, consistent possibly with an impact of some sort.
How about the armpits? Are the armpits the protected area of the body?
Yes.
And if someone had an injury there, would that be an unusual place for them to have an injury?
It would be, yes.
Did Did you notice any injuries to Layla in the armpit area?
I don't recall offhand sitting here. If there are, you can show it to. I just don't recall sitting here at this moment.
I'm going to show you state 32. Kind of see that this area right here, kind of going into the armpit.
You know, you talk about this here.
There's bruising over there too, but you also see this area right here.
Yeah, I mean, there's some here. This almost look like grip marks. The way the flash that was taken has obscured some of this. I mean,
That's actually the light bulb, so I can
oh,
move it.
I see.
Yeah.
You can see.
So if you need me to move it, just let me know.
Strange.
But
It's not the best picture. I mean, there's a lot of shadow down here. I honestly am not sure about exactly what that is, just because there's a great deal of shadow that's in this. And perhaps you have better views.
I do. State's 33. Do you see better here?
Somewhat, yeah. It looks. There's a discoloration there.
There's a discoloration. So
It
that,
looks like it.
and that's another protected area of the body, correct?
Well, it's up. It's really on the left upper front of the chest. I don't think it's quite gotten into the axilla yet.
But heading that way, would that be safe to say?
Well, I don't know. Heading that way, it works.
How about the groin? Is the groin a protected area of the body?
Generally, I would say yes.
Okay. And so you generally wouldn't expect to have children accidentally injuring their groin area, correct?
Yes, I would say you usually wouldn't. And if something like that were to happen, well, if the child's old enough, they should be able to tell you. It'd be something relatively memorable.
Now, did you look at the photographs of this child's groin area?
Yes.
Okay, and did that cause you any cause for concern?
Well, it's looking at them standing alone, without any other history or information, all the things we've been talking about earlier today, could they be alone concerning? Sure. Could they be part of, the frenetic resuscitative attempts? Sure.
And what part of the resuscitative attempt would involve the child's labia majora?
The labia majora, I don't, at what point during when Ms. Rosenbaum was trying to do what she was doing and moving the child around and moving her hands, I can't tell you exactly where her hands were every single, at every single moment or every part of the sequence. I'm not sure that she knows specifically.
Okay. But you think that the injuries that we see on the child's labia majora are consistent with, and I'm showing you the pictures that were taken from the hospital. Do you think that's consistent with the history that you've been given?
Well, in and of itself, what I see, there's a little linear something in through here.
Well, and I think that's important, right? The direction in which a bruise occurs. Is that correct?
The direction.
You talked a little bit about pattern, right? How you get the bruise where you hit the part of the body. Is that correct?
You get the bruise. I'm sorry.
In the area where you hit the body.
Oh, okay.
So
There's some transference. Okay.
Right. So if I hit right here,
yes.
If I hit my arm against it right here, like this, would you expect my bruise would go down my arm like this?
It's reasonable. Yes.
Okay. So explain to me how these vertical injuries that we see on, what was that, the right labia majora?
Yes.
You think that's consistent with the resuscitative methods?
Well, she was wearing a pull-up that I saw when she first was taken to the hospital. So how exactly where that came from? You see, it's very odd. It's really relatively thin, narrow. I don't see any fingernail scrapes specifically that I could really pull out of this.
Well, let me ask you
exactly what caused that. I can't tell you.
You can't tell us.
No.
Okay. Now you mentioned an important point. She was wearing a pull-up, correct?
Yes.
To your understanding, the child was wearing a diaper or a pull-up throughout the entire incident.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. So in a pull-up or a diaper has some padding to it, correct?
Yes,
That's the whole purpose of it.
yes.
All right, and the padding would probably decrease the likelihood that you would see any kind of injury.
Hopefully, possibly, it certainly could, depending on what one was doing and how one was doing it.
Okay. If you see a area of the body that is a protected area that is injured, would that cause you concern?
In and of itself, alone, I mean, I think that conclusion is not unreasonable, at least as a place to start, until one has, history, circumstances, other things like that. But just looking at the injuries alone, then I think that's not unreasonable, like I said, at least as a place to start.
Okay. And but would you agree with me that people generally children, when they fall, generally bruise kind of the bony prominences, like their elbow, their knee, things that kind of jut out?
Well, yes, and when they fall, like you're describing, the most common places are, the bony protuberances, elbow, shin, chin, forehead, things like that, just because that's I would say, the typical appearance of most usual childhood injuries.
Okay. Now, you talked to Ms. Mull a little bit about this particular injury on Millie, correct?
Yes.
And is it odd to you that you don't see any injury over the elbow?
Was it odd to me?
Yes.
Not particularly. If what she had described, say, was running and playing and falling on her elbow, well, then that I would expect to see, if that was the information she gave, I would expect to see, say, some sort of contusion here and not here.
Okay. Is this the first time that you've testified in an abdominal trauma case?
No, I'm sure I've testified in others.
And have you also testified regarding, say, elbow injuries versus the fleshy parts of the body?
I don't know. I don't know if I can. I don't have any recollection one way or the other.
Do you recall testifying in Newton County in 2014 in the case of State of Georgia versus Cornelius, Demetra, Richardson, Bethea?
No.
And you were actually the medical examiner on that particular case. You were still with the GBI then.
Okay.
Do you recall testifying that it was odd to you that you did not see any injury on the elbow itself? In fact, you only saw it on the fleshy part, and that to you stood out as being extremely odd.
Well, I mean, you're taking something out of context. I don't remember anything about the autopsy or the case or the situation or whether any explanation had been. Pardon me, sir.
Let's just stop for a second.
Thank you.
Ma'am, can you please get her attention? Unfortunately, ma'am, we can't have you stay. That's a little bit too distracting. All right, let's resume.
Okay.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you.
And if you need to see the transcript, I can, of course, let you see it, okay?
Well, sure. I don't remember anything about the case. There's, well, that's all I can tell you. I mean, if you even have the report, perhaps I could tell you, excuse me,
Sure.
why I said what I said or what the opinions were, the basis for those opinions. But, in a vacuum, I don't know that I can answer what you're asking.
Okay, well, let me see if this is something that you still stand by. You said you can see the elbow, the point of the elbow right there, and that notably there's no bruising on that. The bruising is all over the soft tissue, in the skin and the fat underneath there, but there's nothing on the elbow itself. And that location is not the location I would see bruising. Bruising if someone, say, were to fall and hit their elbow. That's what people do if they could control their fall at all, is to put their arm out and to land on their elbow. That is a distinctly separate injury that did not come from a fall.
Okay, well, from what you're reading, it sounds reasonable. Again, I recall nothing about the case or the context or, why even that question was asked to me, or if there had ever been any, any explanation attempted to be given as to how that bruise was there. So, as I think you can see, well, every injuries may speak for themselves, but context is just as important as the injuries themselves many times.
So you think that the Millie falling from off a bar and hitting like this would cause that injury?
I don't have a problem with it, and as I recall, that is how she herself said that it happened.
Okay. Now, let me ask you this, getting off that topic.
Okay.
The contents that are in the child's stomach, how long after a child eats could you potentially see the contents of something in the child's stomach when they do the autopsy?
Oh, well, okay, once the child dies, whatever is in the stomach is going to stay there indefinitely. Digestion stops. So if there's no evidence that there was any vomiting or anything else, then what one would see in the stomach would pretty much reflect what the child had eaten if the death occurred relatively soon after the food was ingested.
Okay. And the report you got here was that that Layla had been eating, correct?
Yes.
And are you aware that Dr. Darisaw found no evidence of food or no identifiable pieces of food in the child's stomach?
Well, yes. Let me just look here. 35 cc's orange tan soft digestate. So that doesn't,
no identifiable food.
Yeah, it doesn't tell me other than the color and that it was fairly uniform. Anything more?
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about vocabulary. How about that? Neutrophils. Are you familiar with that term?
Sure.
And do you agree with me that microscopically neutrophils can start to appear within hours of an injury?
Within hours, and usually you're talking somewhere around maybe 6 hours or so.
Okay. And so if you see neutrophils in any of the microscopic slides, that lets you know that there's at least 6 hours. It could be older, but it would be at least that amount of time old, correct?
That's fair, yes.
Because before that, you wouldn't expect to see anything.
Correct.
And that's kind of why you use that terminology. You can't tell if none of that microscopic stuff is present, you can't tell if it's 5 minutes versus 5 hours old.
Yes, that's a general concept, yes.
But once we get beyond that a little bit, that's when we can start seeing those healing processes.
Exactly.
Pigmented macrophages, are you familiar with that?
Yes.
And that's essentially iron is present?
Yes.
And that generally kind of comes into play around 48 hours.
Yeah, 2 to 3 days. That's a general reasonable time frame.
Okay. How about hemosiderin? Are you familiar with that term?
Yes.
And similarly, would you expect to see hemosiderin in around 48 hours?
Yes, about the same time, because the hemosiderin is the breakdown product of red blood cells, and that is what actually the macrophages gobble up.
Okay. So by seeing those things, we can tell that it's probably at least 48 hours, maybe older than that.
Yes.
But on the back end, it's how long they stay around. That's not quite as concrete, correct?
Correct.
All right. But we can tell at least 48 hours, right?
At least in that, as I said, 2 to 3 days. That's a reasonable time frame because once again, everyone's somewhat different.
All right. I want to talk to you a little bit about some things that could be highly suspicious for child abuse.
Sure.
Let's see if you agree with these. That there are certain types of injuries that we talked about that could be highly suspicious for child abuse, correct?
Sure.
And posterior rib fracture is one of them.
Yes.
And certain fracture types could be highly indicative, correct?
Certain ones, yes.
So for example, and I know it's not present here, but something like classic metaphyseal lesion is highly indicative of child abuse, correct?
It is, yes.
All right. What about liver injuries? They can be quite common in child abuse too, correct?
Oh, yes.
Because the liver's kind of big, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's the biggest organ in the body outside of the brain, yes, and the skin.
I was going to say, I'd always heard of the skin.
Yeah, well, in the body.
How about, this is just, you see 474 behind you, correct?
Yes.
That's a pretty good diagram.
Yes.
All right, and so the liver actually hangs just below the rib cage a little bit, correct?
Yes, the rib cage would be sort of like that.
Now, in general, pancreatic injuries are actually quite rare, correct?
They are, yes, they are much less common because the pancreas is very deep and behind the liver.
And so the pancreas is kind of protected by all the other organs, right?
Yes, it's surrounded.
And so it's really in there, right? It's kind of got padding all around
Well,
it.
yes, it's deep and sits just right in front of the vertebrae, yes, but it of itself is protected.
Are spleen injuries more common than pancreas injuries? I know the spleen's not up there. I can put that one up there if you'd like.
Yes, because the spleen is really more exposed. Oh, there you go. The spleen is, that's a kidney. Oh, there you go, spleen. Yes, it's more, because the spleen is more exposed, and it's very frequently injured, well, accidentally, falls, motor vehicle accidents, things like that.
Okay. Now, would you also agree with me that sometimes abdominal trauma can be difficult to detect on the skin?
Oh, yes,
So someone could be punched or kicked and it actually doesn't leave a bruise, right?
correct.
Because the blood vessels in that region of the body have, I guess, somewhere to go and they don't break.
Well, yeah, they don't break, and the abdomen is, as mine is, soft and really can distort a great deal without really tearing anything to leave a bruise behind.
So the abdomen, as far as the body goes, the abdomen does kind of absorb some of the shock that may come to it.
Yes.
And if the shock is a directed area, let me put it this way: if the shock is kind of across the entire abdomen, would that be a different type of injury versus a more directed, say, punch or blow?
Well, yes, the force was distributed across the abdomen. That would, diffuse the amount of energy that really is being focused in the abdomen to cause injury versus a real central, say, focused direction of force right in the center.
I can put the
Right about, there you go, in the middle part. I mean, right in through here, which is, the pancreas is hiding back behind there.
So if it's a blow across the entire abdomen, the force is distributed evenly across the whole abdomen, correct?
That's fair, yes.
A directed blow, however, punch, kick, something like that, that's going to be very directed to that specific area, correct?
Yes.
And that's going to, the force is not going to be distributed over the entire abdomen, correct?
Correct. It's really more, focused. That's exactly the term.
Now, as far as things that are highly suspicious for child abuse, would you agree with me that a delay in reporting could be highly suspicious for child abuse?
Possibly, if whoever was in charge of reporting had knowledge that there was, an injury and then did not report it, or there was, took an excessive, whatever subjectively is felt to be an excessive amount of time, that potentially is at least an indicator that there could be abuse or neglect involved.
Would you agree with me that the research shows that abuse can also tend to increase over time?
Yes.
So maybe in the beginning it's a hit, but then kind of escalates. Would you agree with that?
It can, yes.
All right. Would you agree with me that a changing history provided by the caretaker about how the child was injured is also suspicious for child abuse?
Well, yes. Again, it can be depending on how the history changes, or what things what things are different from, say, one one description versus another description, and things that are radically different. Then that's the more greater the difference, I would say, the more the red flags go up.
Okay. And would you consider differences in how the child was actually injured, like the mechanism of injury? Would you consider that to be a pretty significant difference?
Well, again, it could be, assuming that the description that is being given is reliable, or makes sense. I mean, giving a history that makes no sense whatsoever and compared with the injuries, but then is altered or changed with time that to correlate with the injuries. Well, that would be suspicious, certainly.
And siblings living in the same household that have suspicious injuries, that could also be concerning for child abuse. Would you agree with that?
Oh, you say just siblings having other injuries?
So siblings living in the same household that both had suspicious injuries, that would be concerning for child abuse.
Sure.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about Dr. Darasaw.
Sure.
You hired her, didn't you?
I did, yes.
And she's worked with you the entire time that she's been at the GBI, correct?
Yes.
She trained under you?
Yes.
She trained along with a lot of other pathologists, correct?
Oh, yes.
You think pretty highly of her work, do you not?
I do, yes.
You actually created the Director of Pediatric Forensic Pathology position for her.
Yes.
And you believe that she's extremely qualified to conduct autopsies?
Oh, yes.
Okay. And you believe she actually does pretty much all of the pediatric autopsies now at the GBI, correct?
Yes, that's at least at the time I retired, that pretty much was the case, and at least my understanding is that she does continue to do that. Yes.
And the GBI now covers autopsies for the overwhelming majority of the state, correct?
Yes, about 153 of the 159 counties, more or less.
All right. You believe that her work is? Would you agree with me that her work is thorough and meticulous?
I would, yes. She creates the reports she creates are easily better than the vast majority of autopsy reports like this that are done.
In fact, in this case, when you and I spoke, you said that she probably did about 5 to 7 times the amount of work that most forensic pathologists would have put into a case, correct?
I think that's reasonable, considering I've looked at an awful lot of reports done by an awful lot of other people, and her work is very thorough, which helps everyone.
Okay. She likes to be in the lab, right?
She does. She really prefers to be kind of in the morgue doing her work.
Would you consider her to be dedicated to her work?
Yes.
Now, she's actually board certified in pediatric pathology, correct?
Correct.
As far as I'm aware, she's the only forensic pathologist employed at the GBI that is also a pediatric pathologist, correct?
Yes, in the United States, there's really only a handful of pathologists. Probably, I would estimate maybe less than 10 who are forensic pathologists, but also boarded in pediatric pathology. Yes.
So she has a lot of training and experience specifically in the pediatric cases, right?
Well, yes, especially, pediatric pathology really focuses more on diseases of children, cancers, and things like that. But nonetheless, she underwent that further training and got board certified, so that's excellent.
And once she came on board and was doing all the pediatric stuff, you didn't really do pediatric cases anymore, correct?
Not so many. Myself, she was, I made sure that other junior pathologists, definitely did do pediatric cases because everyone needs to know how to do them themselves. But, as she and the other, as I really took more of a supervisory role with the passage of time, I was less and less, say, the autopsy pathologist.
Now, would you agree with this, that in your last 10 years at the GBI, you actually only conducted 2 pediatric autopsies?
I don't know. Perhaps you looked at numbers and things like that. I personally can't tell you.
Dr. Darasaw took comprehensive photographs in this case, correct?
She did, yes.
Both of the inside and the exterior?
Yes.
And she looked for evidence of deep bruising, correct?
Yes.
And that's important in a child abuse case, isn't it?
Yes.
You also have testified a lot in custody, police in custody type cases, correct?
Yes.
And you've discussed how that police in custody cases are in a lot of ways very similar to child cases, that you need to do an extremely thorough exam, correct?
Yes.
And you also have to do the incisions of the entire body and kind of open up to look for deep bruising, correct?
Exactly.
And she did that in this particular case.
Yes.
And you had no issues with the autopsy that she performed in this case.
No.
Okay. When you and I spoke, we spoke about you took a look at the microscopic examinations, correct?
Yes.
And you took no issue with any of the descriptions that she wrote in her report, correct?
Correct.
All right. I think you said it was a very objective description, correct?
Yes.
All right. So you don't recall anything you disagreed with microscopically?
Well, nothing that I disagreed with. We've talked about the ulna itself, but she described what she saw, but really didn't go any farther as far as characterizing what was going on. what it really meant. So, I mean, I can't disagree with what she described, except there was just more to it.
Okay, but she took 44 slides, correct? Or 44 punch biopsies?
Well, 44 tissue slides altogether.
Okay.
I mean, that's the totality of everything she looked at, yes.
And I know regarding the ulna, there may be some issues, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the other ones, you had no issues with any of the descriptions there, correct?
No. Or, yes, that's correct.
Okay. Now, your opinion that you put forth here today is that it was a complex sequence of events that the defendant took to save Layla's life, correct?
Yes.
All right. And you base that in large part upon the history that you received from Jennifer Rosenbaum. Is that correct?
Well, yes, her statements and, and then her recounting of everything to me, yes.
Okay. And so, but her statements, they played heavily into your opinion here today. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, that's fair.
Okay. And you found her, well, I'll back up. Would you acknowledge here today that Miss Rosenbaum has a motivation to lie?
Well, it's an interesting question in the sense that, she is on trial. I would suppose that would potentially be a motivation in and of itself. Although I'm not, just saying that, I'm not sure how she could really come up with everything that she did, which correlates with the various injuries, but that's, sort of a separate question.
Okay, we'll get there. But you acknowledge that she's on trial for murder, correct?
Oh, yes.
That's a motivation to lie.
Well, it probably is. I've not been in that situation, so I can't tell you any different.
Did you compute that into your opinion here today?
No, actually, no.
Let me ask you this. If there were any flaws in the history that was provided to you, could that potentially change your opinion?
I think if there were serious flaws that, at least in my mind, that did not adequately explain, what I have seen and what I have observed, then, then yes, potentially it could be a problem for me.
Now, if there were problems with the credibility of the source of your information, meaning the person, could that also affect your opinion?
Possibly, it possibly could, although usually, the vast majority of child deaths that I've dealt with have not had anywhere near as complex of a history and sequence of events. Usually it's more that whoever is accused says, I don't know what happened, and then the problem starts from the beginning. So it's not overtly difficult to move beyond that.
When you and I talked, we also talked about an injury that Ms. Mole didn't talk to you about, correct? And that would be the right tibia?
Oh, yes.
Okay. And when we discussed this case, you felt that the history provided was fine, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that you specifically said that no one had any concerns. None of the doctors had any concerns, correct?
At least not that I recall. There was nothing more that was done, to examine the child other than, what was, finding the fracture and then putting a cast on and then, checking her again.
What was your understanding of how Layla hurt her right tibia, her right leg?
She stepped in a hole at, her Mima's house, something like that.
Okay. Is that it?
Well, then there was a question about perhaps a gymnastics injury. I think that it was not really appreciated that anything was wrong for a few days. The child was limping, and finally was brought to medical attention after a few days, and then lo and behold, the fracture was found.
And so, based upon that, you found that was a suitable history, correct?
It was in and of itself to me, unless there was something else that I just didn't see anything else that really made me concerned. Just because this was, not unusual for an accidental injury, an accidental fracture like this to occur, and based on that, I didn't, for myself, I didn't see the need to move any further beyond. And as I said, she'd been seen by an orthopedist, and as far as I knew, that was the end of it.
We discussed how, a few minutes ago, we discussed how a changing history could be concerning for child abuse, correct?
Yes.
And a changing history could give you concerns about the credibility of the source for your opinions here today, correct?
Potentially, yes.
All right. So let's talk a little bit more in depth about the history regarding the right tibia.
Okay.
And I'll ask you if you were aware of these statements. Are you aware that let me just give you some time context. That the first day that she went to the urgent care was Monday, October 19th. Okay.
Okay.
On that day, she was actually Layla and Jennifer Rosenbaum were actually at the gymnastics center where Millie was taking a class. Jennifer tells one of the other mothers that was present at the gymnastics place that Jennifer hurt her leg in the yard trying to do gymnastics. So not at the gymnastics place itself.
Jennifer hurt your leg?
I'm sorry, Layla hurt her leg.
It's okay.
Yes, trying to do gymnastics in Jennifer's yard.
Okay.
Okay. Was that different than what you had heard?
Well, it's different than stepping in the hole. I think, what I gleaned from it was that all that was known was that the child was limping somewhat, but exactly what happened and when it happened just really was not terribly clear.
Not terribly clear. Were you also aware that Miss McKee, the other mother at the gym, asked why Jennifer didn't take Layla to the hospital if her leg was hurting, and she said she was tired of the doctors asking all their questions?
I read that statement, yes.
Was that concerning to you?
Well, one never knows, especially when someone else writes a statement like that. But the child was taken to urgent care, and then the fracture was diagnosed and it was treated beyond that. So, that as far as well, I don't know why the other lady said what she said, or the accuracy of all that. That's hard to say.
All right. The history that was given to the physician assistant at the urgent care center, okay, and this was on October 19th. I know it can get confusing, so if you need me to repeat any dates, feel free to let me know. Okay.
It's okay.
On October 19th, so the same day that they were at the gym class, Layla was taken by Miss Rosenbaum to Hudson Bridge. And the history that was given was first that the child fell at Nana's house last week, and then she fell off a bar at gymnastics 2 days later. So that was reported. Is that kind of what you recall as well?
Yes.
All right. And it's safe to say that the physician assistant that was at the urgent care in and of itself didn't think there was anything concerning, correct?
Correct.
All right. Are you aware that she, later that day, she communicated with the child's biological mother? And she told the child's biological mother nothing about falling at Nana's house. Are you aware of that?
No.
Does that concern you at all?
Well, again, not necessarily, only because the exact point in time at which the bony injury occurred, I don't think really anyone really knew. That was a problem of finding the fact that there was a fracture, then trying to determine, well, when did this happen and what may have happened, and of course with a 2-year-old it can be extremely difficult to do so. So as far as why Ms. Rosenbaum didn't relate this to the biologic mother, I'm not sure that I can draw any significance one way or the other.
Okay. Are you aware of the fact that Layla had not been over at her grandmother's house for at least several weeks, but possibly months?
No, I can't tell you I was.
Okay. And the fact that she had not been over there to fall in a hole, would that cause you concern about the story, the history that was provided?
Oh, okay. If the child had not been over there to fall in the hole, well, then that would constitute something that did not happen, could not have happened.
The defects worker, Miss Rosenbaum, the day of, so we're still on October 19th, the defects worker was advised by Miss Rosenbaum only that she fell off the bars at gymnastics, mentioned nothing about falling at Nana's house. Again, anything concerning to you?
Well, again, alone, I don't know. I mean, now that putting it together retrospectively, if the fall at Nana's house didn't occur, well then perhaps the fall off of the bar, happened. Again, I think without being able to know that, I'll say, if the fracture had been so severe initially, whenever it occurred, that emergency care was sought very rapidly, then it'd be much different. But it's, something that was subtle, that really took several days to, I would say, become detected or just, to seek medical care.
Okay.
Alone, I'm not sure I'd be concerned.
Now, are you familiar with the term doctor shopping?
Yes.
And in the context of child abuse, what does that mean?
Well, that means that if a parent or a caregiver has been abusing a child, then they may see one doctor and then all of a sudden go to see another doctor. Change physicians, sometimes several times because the child may need medical care of some sort, but the caregiver doesn't want to run the risk that abusive injuries may be suspected.
Were you aware that Ms. Rosenbaum took Layla to the Pediatric Orthopedics Associates the next day, so now we're on October 20th, to see Dr. Sean Duxbury?
I recall, that visit, I've seen the record.
You've seen that record. Do you recall whether or not anyone had any concerns at that particular visit?
Offhand, sitting here right now, I don't remember that there was a concern. Can't tell you there wasn't, but I just don't remember.
Sure. I'll put it up. I'm putting states 182 on the screen.
Oh, yeah.
Do you see what Dr. Duxbury wrote about under the section plan?
Yes, I do. I recall that now, yes.
So he was concerned, correct?
Yes.
And he specifically said that he's having them go up to Eggleston where they can be evaluated by social work.
Yes.
And are you aware that he told Ms. Rosenbaum that directly, and she said that she was going to go?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Are you aware that she never went to Eggleston Hospital?
At least I don't recall seeing records reflecting that.
Okay. The fact that she was advised that she needed to go to Eggleston Hospital, said she was going to go, and did not go, is that concerning?
Potentially could be, yes.
Now, when she met with Dr. Duxbury, she also gave she provided some dates, more specific dates.
Okay.
And those dates are a little bit different than the ones that she provided the day before. Would that be concerning?
It would, looking at it now, with respect to other dates that she had given before. Now, is this what it says? 10, here we go. 10 to 15. That person goes back to it. I'm sorry. That's the date. There's the dash through me.
Yeah. So first occurrence,
Yeah.
she said 10:15. The second occurrence,
Yeah.
she said 10:16.
Yes.
That appears.
But if it's known that she did not go to Nana's house, well, then we would know now that did not occur.
Would that cause you concern about the history provided by this particular person then?
I think it could, yes.
Now, are you aware that we talked about she didn't go to Children's Healthcare? Dr. Duxbury actually followed up to see. Were you aware that he was following up to see if she had actually gone?
No.
Were you aware that ultimately he was told that the child was in defects, and that's why he kind of thought that everything was okay?
Yeah, I can't tell you that I'm aware of that.
Now, you are aware that Layla then went to another doctor 3 days later, correct? October 23rd, she went to Children's Orthopedics of Atlanta and saw a physician assistant by the name of Chuck Coppinger.
Yes, I remember seeing those.
That one sounds familiar. Do you recall reading in there that there was no mention, again, of any injury occurring at Nana's house? Only the injury at gymnastics?
Yeah. No, I don't recall specifically about that.
I should also mention that she did report, and on the 19th, she reported to the child's great-grandmother that that the child had broken her leg. But of course, she did not mention anything about falling in the great-grandmother's yard. Does that seem a little odd to you?
Yeah, it's unusual.
Now, when you reviewed, back to Mr. Coppinger on the 23rd, when you reviewed his records on the 23rd, are you aware that the date that she gave for falling at gymnastics was Sunday, October 18th.
No, I can't tell you. Sitting here right now, I don't remember the specific date she gave.
Okay. Would you like to look at it, or do you?
Oh, if that's, I mean, if you want to show me, that's fine. Let me keep this in the, keep it straight.
I'm going to get those for you, okay?
Okay, no problem.
We have almost 500 exhibits here, so sometimes it gets a little confusing.
I understand.
At that particular appointment, she said that the child fell off a beam. That's what Mr. Coppinger recalls.
Yes.
Is that different than falling off a bar?
Well, I don't know. I don't do gymnastics. It's been a long time since my kids did it. So
Haven't done it in a while?
Bar versus beam. Yeah.
Okay.
I watched the Olympics.
All right. The next week, she goes back to the gym tech, and at this point, Layla is in her cast. And people that are there at the gym ask, "Oh my gosh, is she okay? How did that happen?" And Ms. Rosenbaum never mentions that Layla was injured right there in their facility. Does that seem odd to you?
Well, in that it does, in the sense that this is, potentially a safety issue there at the gym. I mean, that I can see that.
Do you think it's a safety issue at the gym?
Possibly, or it could be construed as such, or liability, something along those lines. But I think the gym would, myself, I can't tell you universally, but I would think I would want to tell the gym people.
You would want to tell them.
That's what I'm saying, at least as far as myself would go.
Now, you also read a lot of the DFACS reports too, correct?
Yes.
And you recall reading the summary of the interview that Ms. Rosenbaum gave with Emanuela Carr. That was on the night of Layla's death.
Yes.
And do you recall that in that particular interview, Ms. Rosenbaum said that after gymnastics, so after the gymnastics class, the child appeared to be completely fine, and a few days later, that's when she brought the child to the doctor. Does that change in the history concern you as well?
Well, yes, because as I recall, that she did not appear to be completely fine, which is why they went to the doctor.
So taking into account all of these changes in the history, does that affect your ability to rely upon the statements of Ms. Rosenbaum when coming to your conclusion in this case regarding Layla's death?
Well, it's a broader question. With respect to the leg in and of itself, I can see that there are things that are contradictory, that are left out or added in or changed. As far as that goes. Now, it's also, as I think I tried to indicate too, this is a fairly simple sort of injury, if you will. It's an uncomplicated, non-displaced leg fracture, and everything else, the complex of all the injuries we've been talking about today and that I've gone through, that's a much more complicated set of injuries, really, and spread over multiple areas of the child's body. And then, of course, we have the autopsy and showing timing and all these other sorts of things. And when it comes to that, what I can see in my mind is an explanation that reasonably tells me or shows me how all of these different things might have occurred, with the understanding that I don't think I could ever get, I don't think anyone could ever get an exact, complete recounting of it. I think that's not possible for human beings to do. But what I read and what I heard from her, to me, correlated and made sense. So, and that's the best I can tell you.
But you said here before, and you agree, that you rely heavily upon her statements informing your opinion, correct?
Well, yes, I did. I mean, we have to. That's the nature of what forensic pathologists do, unless there's a situation where the injuries speak for themselves and especially are wildly at odds with a history, even if a history is given. So those situations are far less difficult. This is much more challenging.
But just yes or no, you rely heavily upon her statements in coming to your opinion that you said here today, correct?
Well, yes, I have to, because that's the only recounting, the historical recounting of how any of these events may have occurred.
I'm going to ask you if you agree with this statement. Witness statements are all over the place. I've known that for years. Anyone who deals with this knows this. Sometimes they're reliable, sometimes they're complete fabrications. The facts of the injuries are the compelling issues. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes, I imagine I probably said that at some point or another.
You did.
That sounds familiar to me, or at least the way that I tend to talk. And I agree with that. They can, witness statements especially, can be utterly unreliable at times. But again, that's why the injuries have to be compared with the history as given.
But again, you acknowledge that the witness statements, and in this case, the only witness is Ms. Rosenbaum, right?
Well, yes.
So the witness statements could be complete fabrications.
Oh, could it be? Is it possible? I can't tell you that it's not. I'm not sure I could make up a sequence of events to explain everything that was found here, especially if she didn't know about it.
Mm-hmm. But the quality of the source, the reliability of the source, does that cause you any concern? Any concern?
You're asking me a question I'm not sure you want to know. It's consider the source, and well, you know, I've gotten information from all kinds of different sources, up to and including law enforcement and attorneys, and I'm not sure that it's up to me, I think, to assess what it is that I believe is relevant and not.
So you make the determination as to what's relevant and what's not, and who you're going to believe and who you're not going to believe, correct?
Well, I have to, at least with respect to interpreting injuries. I mean, it's that's ultimately, I would say, what's left up to me.
So knowing what you now know about the inconsistent history that was given with the leg, that doesn't affect at all your opinion here today? Well,
it doesn't affect it only because I've tried to imply, and perhaps I've been unclear, the complex nature of everything that is found on and inside Layla's body, and the mechanisms and the ways in which all of these things would occur in the context, the overall context of intense resuscitation attempts in a choking child. That, to me, is where I would say the puzzle pieces start to fall together.
Could it also be from abuse?
Could it be? I mean, there are injuries that she has that, and we've talked about, that I think are abusive. They were inflicted by someone else at some point in time. But, and is it? But altogether, everything altogether, I don't think, well, I wouldn't be sitting here. I can't make this into abuse because of the complex history that, even though it came from Ms. Rosenbaum, there's not a way that, as far as I know, that she would be able to tell me or anyone else who interviewed her what she did and how she did it that would explain the multiplicity of different injuries on this child.
Okay. Now, Ms. Rosenbaum, to your knowledge, this happened in Ms. Rosenbaum's home, correct?
Yes.
And are you aware that she gave a statement first at the hospital, correct?
Yes.
And then she went back to her home the first time, and that's when the search warrant was conducted, correct?
Yes.
And are you aware that after the search warrant was conducted, Ms. Rosenbaum and her husband were then allowed to remain in the home?
Oh, after the search warrant was conducted, yes. I think I understand that, yes.
So, and then the interview with the police took place 6 days later, correct?
Yes.
So they were living in the crime scene, essentially, for 6 days?
Yes.
Before Ms. Rosenbaum gave that statement?
Yes.
How often do you see it where people have access to the crime scene for 6 days prior to going and giving a statement?
Actually, calling it a crime scene, Your Honor, that's what the jury is supposed to determine.
All right, well, the jury's finder of facts. I'll allow the characterization. That's your contention.
Yes.
Honestly, I really can't tell you how. I'm not in law enforcement and don't conduct search warrants and and law enforcement investigations. I just don't have a way to answer that.
Okay. Now, you mentioned going back to the house, though.
Yes.
And you went back to the house 3.5 years, probably about 3.5 years after Layla's death, correct?
Yes, it was last spring. Yes.
Okay. And you went back there because you were paid to go back there, right?
Well, I went back there because I asked to. That being paid, I could have easily just, frankly, stayed at home. But I was, I was interested. This had really caught my professional interest, and I wanted to try to understand as best as I could.
Are you being paid in this case?
Yes, I'm charging for my time. Yes, in my review.
Okay. How much have you charged so far?
Altogether, for everything up into including coming yesterday and today, which is just a flat fee, it'll be a total of $7,500.
$7,500. And does that include the visit to the Rosenbaum's home back in this spring?
It includes, everything. Once I agreed to look at the case, then it really didn't matter. Anything, I kept no track of all the time that I used.
But you went there because essentially you were retained in this particular case.
I had reached. I hadn't completely reached a decision that I was going to pursue this further professionally. Mm-hmm. But so that was why I was. To me, I was trying to gather information to understand things better.
Now, you also mentioned that it's not unusual, or it's rather unusual for the medical examiner, his or herself, to go to a scene where a crime may have been committed.
It is at the GBI. It happens sometimes, depending on the proximity to Decatur, and also what the issue is at hand, what the crime is at hand, or the suspected crime, I should say. But in general, the ME relies on either investigators or upon lay coroners around the state,
Okay.
or GBI agents.
So it's not unusual that Dr. Darasaw didn't go to the scene.
No, I wouldn't consider it to be unusual. No.
All right. We talked about the statement that Ms. Rosenbaum gave to DFACS the night of, and you're familiar with that, correct? Yeah. We also talked about the statement that she gave on 11/23, 6 days after, to the police, right?
Yes.
All right. Now, were there some differences in that statement?
As just sitting here, I recall there were some differences. I wouldn't say that they were radical or incredibly contradictory that I can recall.
What does it look like when a person is going into shock?
What's it
look like? What are the outward signs of when someone goes into shock?
Oh, okay, I see. Pallor of the skin, really not moving very much, maybe waxing in and out of consciousness. Heart rate fast, labored breathing. That's in general, but a person looks ill, pale.
Mm-hmm. And when someone's near death, could they have a seizure or what looks like kind of like a death seizure, something like that?
Oh, it's possible they could have. I think it's relatively vanishingly rare, unless someone has a known seizure disorder already or some other reason. But the possibility exists. Again, it's not something pathologically that can be seen, but I can't tell you that it's impossible.
But you've talked about a lot of things that are rare in this case, right? Like the non-union fracture in pediatric patients?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Like the Heimlich maneuver causing any sort of internal injuries?
Yes.
Okay. Those things are extremely rare, too.
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, are you familiar with, or are you aware that the statement she first said, her first observation of Layla when she was in distress, what she told DFACS on the night of the incident was that she observed the deceased child shaking and appeared white in color. Do you recall that?
Somewhat. I can't recall the specifics. I'm not going to argue with you about it, but I think I recall that in general.
Okay. And when she gave her statement 6 days later, she said, she was kind of red. Does that appear to be a difference in her skin color?
Possibly. She certainly had 6 days to think about it, and with the knowledge that the child was dead and trying to understand what happened.
Mm-hmm. So she had 6 days to think about it. Well,
yes, but as far as the child, Layla choking on a piece of chicken, I'm not aware that ever changed.
Okay. And are you aware that initially what she told DFACS is, as far as what occurred at the sink, is that she placed the child over the sink and patted her several times hard on the back?
Yes.
All right. And what part of the back would you expect someone to be patting?
Well, I would expect, but then again, I'm a doctor, would be the upper part of the back, in a controlled sort of situation, or having the knowledge, of what one is doing and how one is doing it. That's, again, a controlled situation where one is thinking clearly, then that would not be unreasonable.
Behind you is the is State's Exhibit 1, and this
Yeah.
is one of the photographs that was taken at the hospital the night Layla died.
Yes.
Are you aware that Ms. Rosenbaum acknowledged that Layla had some bruising on the top of her back when she gave her statement?
I don't recall that sitting here right now.
Now, when she gave her statement to law enforcement 6 days later, she said, "I'd lean her over our sink counter. I push my weight against her hips and everything, and hold her up so that I could use my hands to pat on her back, and at the same time trying to hold her up to see if anything would flick out."
Yes.
So she's patting her back, correct?
Well, that's what she says. She's patting her back. That's how she's describing it. Yes.
So she's not saying she's punching the child's lower back to create knuckle injuries, correct?
Well, correct. No, she's not saying that. No.
Okay. And that's not what she demonstrated. When she gave her statement to law enforcement, she's not talking about, "Hey, I took the child's back and I went like this."
No, not that I'm aware of. No, I don't think she was demonstrating that. No.
Those are consistent with knuckle marks, correct?
Yes.
That would be a pattern injury.
Well, not the way we look at it, but no, I wouldn't call those a pattern injury. But I would say that they are consistent with knuckle marks, but they're not so exclusive that, well, I wouldn't call them a pattern injury. That's all I can tell you.
Okay. Now, are you aware about the differences between whether or not something she was able to expel something from Layla or not in the two statements?
Well, ultimately that she said she was able to expel the chicken into the sink, but that at that point in time, Layla was not responding and was just, had not spontaneously started to breathe and was appearing to deteriorate.
Mm-hmm. Are you aware that on the night of Layla's death, she told DFACS that she stated that nothing ever came out?
No, I don't remember that. If that's what she said, well, that's what she said.
Okay. And it wasn't until 6 days later, after she's still residing in her home and able to see what is in the sink, what's on plates, what's everywhere, after that period is when she finally says that maybe something came out. Correct?
Objection, Your Honor, that's a misstatement of the facts.
I don't think it...
They'll have to redirect.
If she remained in the home, correct? We agree on that.
Well, yes, but okay, finish, but
Okay. No, we agreed that she remained in the home, correct?
yes, but the police, as I understand it, police stayed there and then they conducted the search warrant and took all the photographs of everything, inside and outside of the house. Before then, they were until the police left and they were allowed to stay in the house.
Correct. So after the search warrant was conducted.
Yes.
So prior,
Trace?
yes.
We've been going for 2 hours.
Sure.
I think it might be a good time to take a short break. Let's take a 15-minute break and then we'll come back. Thank you.